Good morning, Uganda. Thank you so much for being with us. 9 minutes past 8 a.m. You're watching UBC TV. My name is Philomena Masco. Of course, to take you through this discussion and the conversation that we are yet to be having with you. Today is Wednesday, 17th of May, 2023. And in this agenda session, we'll be having a discussion that is very pertinent, that is very important. And of course, when I say that, we are looking at the disabled youth inclusion in the electoral process, persons with disability inclusion in the electoral process. Ever sat down and actually thought about this, to be very, very precise? Well, we'll be looking at all of that, and of course, we'll be getting into the discussions on how we can enhance or we can make sure that the process has a 360 coverage, in as much as other people are given opportunities, in as much as other people are given the facilitation to be part of this process. How about the people with disabilities? Well, we'll be getting into all of that, and this morning I'm very happy to be joined by two wonderful people who will be giving us some of the information, some of the intel, some of the knowledge, and some of the realities that are happening, especially when it comes to our electoral process and where the people with disabilities are standing. Well, this morning I am joined by Cheptowek Betty, who is the Executive Director from Show Abilities Uganda. Betty, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you too for hosting us.
Well, and I am also joined by Otim Ivan. Now, Otim Ivan is the Programs Officer at African Youth Development Link. Thank you so much, Ivan, for making time to be with us
Thank
this
you so
morning.
much. Good morning, and good morning, Ugandans.
Well, I do encourage you to be part of this conversation, to get into our social media pages. Please give us your submissions, your thoughts, your opinions when it comes to the topic at hand. 0709 602 592 is the WhatsApp number. And you can also make use when it comes to Twitter. The hashtag is UBCGMU. Let us know what you think about this. Now, getting into all of this, we know that Uganda's democracy rating continues to remain relatively low, and it's characterized by quite a number of things. Challenges especially, but also we know that aside from the challenges, we have to look at the people who are part of these processes, whether the officers, whether ordinary Ugandans. And that is where we bring in the people with disabilities. Now, in as much as you may not be well informed about what goes on in their lives, what are the challenges they face? Well, Ivan probably will be giving us some of this information, but first things first, Ivan, why people with disabilities, and why, to be very specific, the electoral process?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. So why disability, and why the levels of inclusion in the electoral process? So fundamentally, elections hold on to the mandate that they give people power to choose leaders with whom they ought to demand accountability from. And the fundamental issue in there is participation, and how people meaningfully participate in deciding the people that will govern them, and how they will use their voice to make their choice very hard, make their choice hard, is a very important issue in any democracy. And democracy in its entirety has principles laid out in there. And amongst those principles is ensuring that there is participation, there is equality, there is inclusion, but again also fundamentally basis on accountability. So why people with disabilities? Uganda's election has been progressive for the last, since the multi-party democracy age. But one of the things that we can continue to observe is that the levels of inclusion in terms of how people with disabilities are involved in a democratic process, not just as voters, but even as candidates, is kind of something that we need to rethink as a country. And I'm speaking this in the spirit that we're in a manifesto week, and I know that the government in power is assessing their performance on how they're doing in regards to the manifesto pledge they put forward to. But one of the things that I'm very sure that is going to be very silent is the issue about inclusion and how people with disabilities meaningfully participate.
Yes.
So the fundamental issue here is that how do people with disabilities, how people with disabilities are mainstreamed within their political parties, and that is fundamentally meaningfully mainstreamed within political parties. But again, how does the electoral process kind of bring in the inclusion for people with disabilities in how they access the voting information,
Yes.
in terms of if it's about people with visual impairment. Do we have levels of braille material that can be able to guide them? And one of the things that you can critically observe is that there is no adequate data to disability.
Yes.
And this is the mandate for the National Bureau of Statistics that is mandated to undertake census. So probably, hopefully this year, we want to see how the data sheet is kind of improved in how data is going to be collected to kind of aggregate data for disability. Because the Electoral Commission will tell you we don't have data for disability in terms of how we can be able to plan. So how does the national database kind of improve in an inclusive perspective?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Betty, going through some of these, because now we are looking at inclusion of people with disabilities, some of the challenges that you can take us through. I mean, for the previous elections we've had more than 2-3 elections, and we know that again, like Ivan talked about, even then we would be expecting that we are going to be less vocal about the issues, but some of the challenges that people with disabilities have had to experience while trying so much to be part of the processes, do you think you can take us through some of those?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Once again, my name is Cheptoek Betty. I'm the Executive Director, Show Abilities Uganda, which is the umbrella organization for youth and led by youth with different disability categories. I'm going to be speaking more about the experiences, the challenges that are faced by we as persons with disabilities, and within their intersectionality within the different groups of persons with disabilities. For example, every disability has its own challenges, and most people are not aware of them. And I want to begin with, for example, when it comes to capturing data, sometimes persons with disabilities may not have the thumbprints, and then the law provides that you must have a thumb, like to be captured in the system.
Yes.
So that is already a challenge, because it means that this person whose hands, like the palm, is not there, sometimes their feet are also not there, and so they are left with something, just a quarter of this. So these people will not be accepted to go and thumbprint, and that denies them the opportunity to vote.
Yes.
And then there are those ones with, for example, albinism. In most cases, these elections happen in centers, in places that sometimes are very hot for them and for their skin. And given their skin condition, they are very susceptible to cancers. And so in the end, because of staying long in the sunshine, some of them, if the people who are at the polling station are not sensitive enough to allow them get the priority to go and vote, then the longer they stay in the sun, they will be affected by those conditions of cancer. And then sometimes the distances are also very much common, because where the elections are happening, the polling stations, sometimes it's very far away from where persons with disabilities are located, and then it becomes really a big barrier for them to access the polling stations. And sometimes many of them pull out, and because they are frustrated, they cannot move because they may not have a wheelchair. If they have a wheelchair, it may not be disability friend accessible, because sometimes they are held in places which are very hilly, and if someone does not, you may have a wheelchair, but you may not have someone to push you there.
Yes.
So in the end, they are not able to go and participate in the elections. And this denies them, again, the right to voting, the persons of their own choices. Then there are those with hearing impairment who are deaf, and sometimes because they may not even hear about the campaigns that are going on, hear about the different manifestos that are shared by the different leaders. So in the end, they may not have adequate information to make proper choices of what they feel is relevant or is important and will cater for their needs. Or if sometimes they have the information when they reach at the polling stations, they realize that there are no sign language interpreters, and then they are either battered by the police because they are not understanding what they are saying, that maybe you move to this direction, but the person thinks that this person has heard. In the end, they are beaten. There are sometimes, if there are riots in polling stations, these persons with disabilities are very vulnerable, because the person who is deaf may not hear that they have given instructions that for people to vacate the place. So in the end, they fall victims of violence because they are beaten, and then when they are beaten, they also want to retaliate because they are wondering, why is someone really beating me when you have not given me the information through the proper channel that I'm supposed to actually understand. And then for those who are on wheelchairs like myself and the rest, of course, they will not be able to run away, and so they fall victims, because if there are riots, then they will be stepped on, they will be left there. And so I feel that our Electoral Commission should really be very sensitive this time round going forward when it comes to the elections. Let us see how best we can include persons with disabilities. Let's have these elections in accessible places where everybody feels, yes, we are able to make our own choices of the leaders that we want, but also having that right to vote.
Okay. Yeah, now, Ivan, I do understand that there was a series of engagements that were made in several different districts, even here in Kampala, the Metropolitan Center. And I know that also there was lots of dialogue and community engagements and fellowships with the peoples peoples with disabilities. Now, I also understand that there were several key findings that came out of this. Now, before we get into that, I would love for you to take us through some of the opportunities that could have been, that you discovered in the People with Disabilities Electoral College system.
Yes, thank you so much. So, first of all, the opportunities, I would say, are there. And like I said, the electoral process has been progressive over the years, but with some limitations. So one of the things that I can speak about, for example, is that the PWD structures exist from the grassroots. Although one of the issues that you can recognize is that these structures are not embedded within the local government system. So they have kind of limitations on how, if you're going to do grounded approaches on how you're mobilizing structures for PWDs to participate in government programs, then you have that limitation. But again, also you have, for example, the Electoral College, which one can say is so small so that then the people with disabilities can participate. But again, meaningfully across, you would say again a limitation is that the Electoral College is so kind of a small number for some kind of inclusive kind of engagement within the electoral process. Because you really find that the people with disabilities want to make their voice heard, maybe through another form of engagement, but then the limitation that they have, small numbers in the college system, is one of the things that we can critically put onto the table and maybe for discussion. The other opportunity is that one of the things that one can identify easily with maybe the people that they will easily want to stand for or stand against in terms of representation, because the number is again so small. So those are the opportunities that we can be able to identify with, despite the also existing legal framework that basically government has put in place to kind of be put into consideration for levels of inclusion. Yes, thank you.
And maybe could you also take us through some of the challenges that you did register in all these findings? Yeah, so one of the challenges that I could first of all pick out for is the high cost of elections, and that this is in regards to the nomination fees. We all know that the electoral process is so costly that the first fee that you pay is either a nomination fee to a party or a nomination fee to the government in terms of the Electoral Commission fees that you pay when you're signing up to be a candidate. And if you're going to be able to be a candidate at MP level, then you have to part 3 million shillings. If we are talking about meaningful participation, especially with maybe young people or people with disabilities, the nomination fee is kind of a barrier to their participation. And we must be able to kind of put this conversation as a country into how we can be able to mainstream levels of participation without actually putting in barriers that are retrogressive in nature. And the other thing that my colleague talked about is that when you look at how the elections are administered, it is administered from a perception that everyone is of equal kind of ability, and not from the mind that there are people who may not have the same ability that we can have. Yes. So if you don't have, for example, election officers administering some levels of basic information awareness on sign language, then you're going to have those kind of challenges. But even across the administration of an election, you don't have maybe basic officers running kind of interpreting this information, either if it's about signing in, if it's about braille material, if it's about any accessible mode of how disability categories just talked about can be meaningfully engaged. The other thing that we can also talk about is that the national register, and that is a national voter register, is not disabilities aggregated. And that means that the Electoral Commission in its entirety will face absolutely challenges in how they can be able to plan. So that's why I told you that if there is a reason that the statistics that is going to be undertaken this year probably can improve on data aggregation on disabilities, then that means that the country can have a very national database, very aggregated in terms of levels of male, gender, and disabilities, and that's how the Electoral Commission can now begin to use some of the data to kind of plan for the elections. The other challenge is across, and this is maybe not only government, but across the players, including media, the accessibility of information. Yes. And how accessible is the information. Of course, the basic support that many media houses play here is supporting sign language interpreters, maybe on news, and which is, I think, is a good thing. And I've seen UBC taking this up as a very at the center. But what happens to the very critical programs? You have seen how the president is making very fundamental speeches. Yes. But behind the president, the people with disabilities are not getting the information. So that kind of limitation is cut across the government system, that you begin to have limitations on how a bigger percentage of people can basically access information. So the other issue that we can actually talk about is that you have the college system that is kindly probably unfavorable for because of the limitations that we can also countless put into place. The cost of, first of all, the election itself. Yes. And also the manipulation that will go into that small number of the electoral college. And again, the issue of the representative kind of sample number of how that sample represents an entirety of a population. So those are some of the challenges that we can be able to talk about.
meaningfully in terms of inclusion and disabilities.
Okay. Well, this morning we're talking about inclusion of persons with disabilities in the electoral process. We're looking at how we can fully and efficiently integrate systems, strategies that will enable people with disabilities be full and part of the election process. Because what is a democracy if we don't have all categories of citizens being generally represented and also doing their rightful duty, especially when it comes to important events like elections, where we get to choose our very own leaders that we entrust with the power to lead a country where we all exist. And I do have Betty and Ivan here taking me through some of the challenges, some of the considerations, and of course much later on we'll be hearing some of the recommendations that came through. But in the meantime, I do have one of our viewers talking about how an election is a clear expression of patriotism. Therefore, no one should be denied a right to be involved in voting. Thank you so much, Peter Chintu. And here, George talking about how there should be equal representation of people with disabilities at all levels of leadership, from parliament, from all local levels to parliament, and even institutions way above that. But also, in addition to that, there is need to see real work being done by the representatives, away from just having specific individuals there being or representing, but what are they actually doing? Are they being practical with the work they're supposed to do? I also have Adonia Muguta Nasasira from Uganda talking about these people with disabilities should also be given representatives at the polling stations. They have a right to participate in elections. Even government as well needs to sensitize the public to stop sidelining people with disabilities, because they deserve all the resources as the other ordinary people also get access to. Thank you so much, Adonia. Now, Betty, I would really love to hear from you. What do you want, or what would you want government to actually do from their side? Because I want to believe that different categories have a role to play here. We have the society, the communities where we say, but even government as well. I think it's like somebody said, representation is very necessary. But what exactly is it that you want the people representing people with disabilities to help you, especially in line with having you fully included in the election processes?
Thank you once again. First of all, for me as Betty, I work with the young people with disabilities who have no representation from the lowest level to the national level.
Yes.
And what I would really want to see is seeing that these people have the platform to speak for themselves, to take responsibility or any other kind of leadership role that they would like to take. But this can only be achieved if, for example, we are included in the policies within this country. Like, for example, the National Youth Council Act is not very explicit about youth with disabilities. It only talks about inclusion of youth with disabilities, but should be co-opted or nominated by an umbrella organization of persons with disabilities. And you realize that the National Youth Council is a big ceremonious kind of structure,
yes,
that has different categories, that should have different categories of youth represented within its structure. And then you know that National Youth Council Act also provides for youth representation from village level, parish, sub-county, district, regional, even up to national level, where we have members of parliament representing the youth. But out of this, there is no representation for youth with disabilities. I have never seen any youth member of parliament who is either in the current parliament or the previous that has ever been particular to speak about issues of young people with disabilities. And if only the policies can be amended to include youth with disabilities, we appreciate the government of Uganda for giving us affirmative action, but I mean it's not enough for us to be only co-opted. Currently, I think we have one representative on national Youth Council, who was picked by an umbrella organization of persons with disabilities. But this person, for the term he has served, he has never even mentioned a word, because he says while he's there, out of 350 delegates, he can never be recognized for the number of times he has put up his hand, because he's alone.
Yes.
And two, people already have a mindset where they believe that that one is going to speak about disability, and so there is that bias. At the end of the day, this person is not able to participate meaningfully. What we are talking about here is meaningful participation of everybody in electoral democracy, because of we are promoting, if we are promoting the slogan of leave no one behind, then we should be in position to see that everybody is meaningfully participating, everybody is representing the constituencies they belong in, so that their issues are heard and have their voice go further. Then the other issue is on the PWD's elections. For me, I have an issue. I am one person who is interested as a patriot of this country to contest. But imagine, we as persons with disabilities, if we are to be voted, we campaign the same way like the president. Imagine you are representing a constituency of persons with disabilities, and because we work within the electoral colleges, we must speak to the electoral colleges in Isinjiro, in Kapchorwa, in Bukwa, in this whole country. And when you look at your finances, sometimes you end up, you know, just being disappointed, and then you give up, because if you look at how you are supposed to cover the whole country, it becomes a really, really big gap.
Facilitation
so
is,
for me, I think the government should also look at regionalizing the elections of persons with disabilities, so that those ones from Western vote for their own leaders within the Western region. Those of Northern, regionalization generally, that's what I mean, so that we don't have to move from Eastern to Western to Northern to Central, because it is quite expensive. And then he has mentioned the issue of the fees that is paid. A poor person with disability may not afford to pay for nomination fees, and in the end, their representation, they may have the capacity, they may have the capability, they might be very articulate in a way, but because they do not have the financial muscle to be able to champion and compete with others favorably, so that becomes a challenge. So I think the government, Electoral Commission, should also try to revise the fees, because I work with young people who may be also very vibrant, but they do not have the capacity or the businesses that can enable them get the money that will qualify them to vie for any elections.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ivan, what are some of the recommendations you are making, all the way from, you know, addressing some of these gaps in the policy framework to all the way to other, of course, spreading to other levels of regulation, other levels of resource funding, and very many other things that we need to put into perspective while we are looking at this?
Yes, first of all, I want to recognize that the institutional and the legal framework to disability inclusion in our electoral process exists, though with some limitations, just like we have been trying to highlight here. And you could do an assumption that maybe the situation is not as problematic as we know it, and that is why the attention is not recognized. But one thing that I can tell you, that democracy is about inclusion. If we are going to restate that we're a democratic country, then there's no way we are going to run away from inclusion. So one of the recommendations that you're putting out there is that if the Electoral Commission could, and other players can come into play and establish a guiding protocol on how they can include people with disabilities. And this in terms of capturing the electoral process and the electoral cycle in its entirety. And one of the things that I would like to highlight, for example, and she talked about accessibility to many of polling areas. One of the first exercises that is undertaken in an election is the demarcation of polling areas. Now the question is, how is how is the process inclusive?
Yes.
In the villages where people would decide to say, okay, we can have a polling station A here or a polling station B here. How is the process inclusive? If it's about involvement of parish chiefs there, do these parish chiefs involve people with disabilities in their categories to understand, okay, if I'm going to put a polling station here, is it about accessibility, or is it about some levels of how people will be able to reach there? We identify, for example, there are some areas where the topography of the area is very difficult. In areas like Kanungu, Kabale, where you're talking about the hills, issues around accessibility become very difficult to put into context. But can we say it's a fundamental place to begin with, that even when you're making that decision, can you begin to involve the people? But again, when it comes to the issue around communication.
Yes.
In terms of communication, taking into consideration disability categories, the various modes of communication, braille materials, sign language, how have you involved the actors to understand the usability of some of these tools in across? We have not seen, for example, basic usage of sign language, across very important electoral processes. And this I would speak with kind of information. We have not seen that. Maybe you want to see this going through, because then we deal with their perception that everyone is able as like the other. Then the other issue within the guideline that we can have, if it's about administering an election, if you are capacitating electoral officers to understand disability inclusion, can we give them some basic, I'm not saying the real holistic training on disability communication.
Yes.
Some basic on disability. How do you, first of all, support a person? Of course, we know the election process will say, if you see a person with disability, you can help them in a certain kind of way. But then there are disabilities that are not be able, you cannot see.
Yes,
you can't
it's
see.
not a given.
You can't see. So how do we address that kind of challenge? By giving the officers some kind of basic support in terms of understanding. Then the other one that I told you about is the data. And for us as a people, we have put into a very basic recommendation. And I'll be able to speak this on the national TV. If we were talking about disability data, now this comes with the statistics house, putting into place very, very disaggregative data in terms of disability categories across. And now it will come back to the national database where the National Identification Registration Authority under the Personal Registration Act can put into place a coding system for disability categories, that if I have an ID with a code color, I can be able to identify that person easily. And it's something that is known. This idea can even go up, cutting across accessing services for people with disabilities. Just by showing you my card, I'll know probably you are probably visually impaired, and I'll know probably how I can help you. If I have a code maybe with a blue, I can know maybe you're, So if we have that kind of information aggregated, then we can be able to plan. The Electoral Commission will have data and no excuse to be able to say, in Zimbabwe, in polling station A, we have 5 people visually impaired, and we can plan for them. In a polling station in Kalangala, we have people with hearing impairment, and we can be able to support maybe in them in this kind of way. So we will have data. We'll have data that can be able to support disability inclusion. The other issue that I'll be able to speak about also is that, for example, there are countries that are progressively put into place very best practices. And maybe technology comes in all ICT supportive systems, basic ICT supportive systems. And we can be able to learn from those countries. That's just told you how our limitation with the BVK, biometric voter machine,
yes,
that you will need to verify your votability by just a thumb thumbprint.
The thumbprint, yes.
But with an assumption that all of us have.
Some, yes.
So you see those limitations. So what is the alternative? What are the alternative tools that we can put into place that can be inclusive? You know, if we're talking about probably inclusion, what are those other modes that we can put into place as a country? So these are existing, and we can learn from best practices outside there. And as a country, we can have some of these in play. They may not be sophisticated softwares and devices. They can be basic, just to support kind of inclusion in our day-to-day running of our election administration.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very briefly, Betty, what would be your parting shots?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to add to his voice that he has brought out a very key thing about the invisible disabilities. Like I told you from the beginning, that we work with an intersectionality of persons with disabilities. And we have this category that you cannot easily identify that they have a disability. For example, those with mental or psychosocial disability. When they are in their good mental state, they are on drugs, they are very productive, and they go to the line and show that they have a disability, nobody accepts it, because they are judged to be, you know, people think that by looking at my physical appearance, yes, it has to be physical. And so before they even understand that you have a disability, they've already sent you away. And this one, of course, because it's also a condition of its own, whereby someone can be traumatized or depressed and does something very wrong, or just walks away out of frustration. Then we have these ones with epilepsy. Once they have, because they live on drugs almost on a daily basis, to work and be productive. But once they go to the polling station and then they are denied because of their physical appearance and they are judged not to be having the disability, it becomes a challenge for them also to participate meaningfully. And so for me, my recommendation to, again, Electoral Commission is to really be very mindful about who comes and identifies as a person with disability. Give them the audience, speak to them. There are those who are hard of hearing. If you speak to them directly, they may read your lips and then understand the message you are trying to communicate. But if you yell at them and then you just assume that they have heard you, yet this person has not picked any word from you, it makes really these people feel very frustrated. In the end, that meaningful participation in elections is not realized. So I really want to call upon everybody in the community, in the government, most especially Electoral Commission, to include persons with disabilities in most of the processes that will be coming forth from census. Let persons with disabilities be part and parcel. I'm aware that NUDIPO has started engagements with the Electoral Commission, and we are really looking very much forward to seeing that persons with disabilities in the next elections are meaningfully contributing to their leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty and Ivan, for all that information. Really, we could actually put it to use and make it better. And indeed, it's true that people with disabilities and people from different other special interest groups face these mainstream challenges before the election process, during the election process, and even after the election process. So we need to be very mindful and know that we have to also avail resources, opportunities for them to be able to do what they should be doing for the country. Well, Cheptoek Betty is the ED at Show Abilities Uganda, and our team Ivan is the Programs Officer, African Youth Development Link. Well, we'll leave it at that, but Ruben Chibidango Mpima is coming in with sports updates. Allow me to wish you a wonderful and productive day ahead. My name is Philomena Masco. Good morning, Uganda.